Hi, welcome to the guide you all have been waiting for, my complete Aurelion Soul Guide, Arts of Soul. In this guide, I will go over everything from champion identity to abilities, combos, gameplay, build, matchups, and much more. If you're new to the channel, my name is Justin, otherwise known as Soul. I'm a Grandmaster Aurelion Soul 1 trick who peaked around 500 LP, achieving rank 1 A Soul North America on both pre-reworked Aurelion Soul and reworked Aurelion Soul. I also stream Monday through Friday and upload on this channel weekly, so checking out my channel in the description below as well as subscribing to the YouTube channel really helps me out a lot. But enough of that, let's get right into the Art of Soul. Now, who or exactly is Aurelion Soul? I could go on and on about the in-depth lore of Aurelion Soul, but I'm assuming you're probably just here to learn how to play the champion. All you basically need to know is that Aurelion Soul is a celestial being dragon thing who can be pretty cocky at times, who pretty much made most of the universe. Oh, did I mention his voice actor is the voice of Madara Uchiha for all you Naruto fans out there? So what kind of champion is Aurelion Soul? Aurelion Soul is a hyper carry scaling mage who struggles in the early game but ramps up into the mid to late game, completely carrying games if you can get there. Here's some pros and cons to the character. Pros: he has the ability to completely carry games, hence the name Hyper Carry Scaling Mage. He's pretty easy to pick up but hard to master. This is kind of subjective, but his gameplay can be very enjoyable at times. His abilities are beautiful. I mean, just look at this Empowered R. And lastly, I mean, who doesn't like dragons? I mean, a space dragon? Come on. And now onto the cons. Due to him being a hyper-scaling mage, his early game is pretty weak, which could lead to a boring early game. As of the time making this video, he does have some clunkiness to him and some bugs that need to be fixed. One of the biggest, most argued thing in the community right now is his lack of skill expression. We'll go more in depth to this later in the video. Challenging counterpicks due to his weak early game. And last but not least, low outplay potential, which I'll expand more on later in the video. And now the most important part to learning any champion, the abilities. So first, we're going to go over his basic mechanics of each ability, just in case you've never understood them. Starting with Soul's passive, Cosmic Creator, every single one of his abilities has an aspect that improves with every Stardust. Stardust is a stack mechanic that you can get a couple of ways. They include having your Q on a target for 1 second, minions, monsters, or champions dying when your E is on top or active, and landing your R on champions. Here's exactly what Stardust improves for each ability: Q burst damage, W increased distance, E increased area and execute threshold, and R increased area. Q, Breath of Light. His Q is his main damage ability and also his most controversial one. Soul is unable to move in channels in place, breathing fire. The channel lasts up to like 3.25 seconds for the first 3 levels, becoming an infinite channel duration at max level. Every second you keep your Q on a target, you deal an extra burst of damage. You also gain 1 Stardust every second if you're damaging a champion. The range on it is also increased with level. W, Astral Flight. Soul flies in direction. During flight, his Q has no cooldown, no max channel duration, and his Q flat damage is also increased. Kills or assists within 3 seconds of damaging them refunds 90% of the W cooldown. However, using Q during flight reduces the flight speed by 50%. E, Singularity. Another controversial ability, which is one of his strongest, if not the strongest. It also is one of the most unique CC abilities in the game. Soul summons a black hole that does damage over time, as well as drags enemies towards the center, executing them at a certain threshold, which is decided by how much Stardust you have. Its range scales with level. Now, this ability will take a little bit of getting used to, as you need to figure out how exactly to use it, how strong the pull is, and how to effectively stack with it, as this is mainly how you get Stardust. R, Falling Star or the Skies Descend. This ability is pretty self-explanatory. Soul brings a star down from the heavens. Yeah, badass, right? That comes down to the earth that damages and stuns champions for 1 second, absorbing 5 Stardust for each champion hit. This ability has 2 versions: an unempowered version, which is the one I just explained, and an empowered one. In order to get the empowered R, you need to gather 75 Stardust from the point you level R for the first time, which is at level 6. The empowered R comes down in a large area, deals more damage, knocks up instead of stuns for 1 second, and unleashes a massive shockwave that deals damage to all champions and epic monsters in its path. And yes, you can still Barons this way. The shockwave also slows for 75%. Now onto a more detailed explanation of how the stack mechanic works now that you know the abilities. Stacking is honestly not that intuitive compared to other champions like Nasus and Veigar. This is due to him getting stacks from just interacting with the champs, since his Q gives you a stack every second. Your E stacking on champions as long as they're in it for 1 second, and your R giving you stacks for each champion it lands on. However, there are some things that you should be doing in order to maximize your stacks every game. These include using your E to stack on cannon waves, since cannons give you 3 Stardust instead of the usual 1. Moving off of that, make sure to prep minions so they die during your E, especially in the early game by autoing regular minions once and cutting down cannon minions with your Q. Only have optimal E's. This means to pick the best spot to cast your E that pulls in the maximum amount of minions. Here's an example of a not optimal E, and here's an example of an optimal E. Sometimes if you see a group of enemy champions, just drop an E, as you can get a shit ton of stacks by just pressing one ability and running away. A good time I find to do this is during like level 1 invades, when the enemy team just stacks on top of each other and you can just drop an E and run away. I've literally gotten like 20 stacks level 1 from just doing this. Utilize taking camps like Raptors and Krugs, as this is just an easy way to get stacks for free, as these camps, they just have a lot of monsters, especially Krugs. Also, make sure to drop E right before you take Baron or Dragon, as Baron or Dragon are epic monsters like Herald. They give you 5 Stardust if they die within your E. Other than that, if you really just don't think about stacks, you should just get stacks pretty much naturally playing the game. A good number of stacks I'd say is like 10 per minute by the end of the game. Usually up until 20 minutes, you're probably only going to get like 6 or 7 per minute, which is fine. Just make sure you have at least 10 stacks per minute by the end of the game. And now onto some of the nitty gritty aspects of the champion, ability fundamentals. First, let's talk about his Q. This is your bread and butter of the champion. The whole champion's kit revolves around this one ability, so it's really important to know the ins and outs. For one, as you know, you are completely immobile while channeling the ability. With this in mind, it's important to have spacing down to the wire. What I mean by this is that you need to make sure when you're activating the ability that you're in a spot where you can't immediately get CC'd, you're not directly in front of a champion who can burst you, but you're also close enough so that if they run away, you at least get a couple of procs off. It's also really important to have a general knowledge of enemy champions, as you need to make sure to stay away from anyone who can CC you out of your channel. Q-taps, Q-taps, Q-taps. This is where the tech really comes in and separates the good ASO players from the bad ASO players. I want you guys to study this clip and I'll go more in detail after. Now obviously this Vex didn't play perfectly, as she could have moved around more and flashed away before she died. However, the point of this clip is to show you the fundamentals of Q-taps and Q holding in lane. We want to proc our Comet, mana flow, and presence as soon as they're up every chance we can get it. Notice how I'm continuously alternating positions throughout the lane so that I can find keyword angles on Vex to hit my Q. This is the key to become a good laner on ASO. Q-taps can not only be used for poking, but it can also be used to continuously proc your Rylai's. Here's an example. This is pretty self-explanatory since your Q-taps have little to no cooldown. During a chase, if you just tap it every time it's up, you can continuously proc your Rylai's slow. You can do this if you're just waiting on your W cooldown or trying to stall for your teammates to catch up. Now on to the W. This is another ability of your kit that will separate the bad and great ASO players. W lines. W lines, as you can tell by the name, is the line in which you choose to fly when using the ability. It is super important to choose W lines that both keep you safe and be close enough distance so that your Q will hit. If you take a W line too close to the enemy, you'll die. Take a W line too far the enemy, they won't die. For example, take a look at this situation here. I want you to imagine the most optimal W line to chase down this enemy so that they die. If you chose diagonal, you are right, as we want to take a W line that puts us in a position so that if they run away, they have no choice but to either walk back from where they came from or try to walk out of my flight path. There are, however, some general W lines that are usually safe to take in general situations. If you're chasing an enemy down, you want to W diagonally towards where they're walking like this. If you're about to team fight, a head-on approach will do fine, but it just depends on what your team wants to do. However, there are some angles to W to the side of enemies in a fight to get around their front line and potentially burst the enemy backline, but make sure not to die. Which leads me to my next point, dying using this ability. This is usually where newer ASO players tend to struggle, as it's super easy to die using this ability if you don't know what you're doing. Usually what I say to newer ASO players is that if you cast a W and realize mid-flight that it could potentially go bad, just cancel it by activating W again. Not only does canceling stop you from dying, but it can actually secure some kills/damage while keeping you alive. This is especially relevant in lane, as sometimes you may find yourself wanting to fly towards an enemy champ to trade, but you don't want to be under the tower. So what you do is you would WQ, and as soon as you reach the outer limit of the tower range, just press W to cancel while still holding Q to stay safe. A small but useful thing to know about the ability is how it interacts with terrain or walls. Something to utilize is canceling your W inside a wall so that you actually teleport to the other side faster. This can be useful when you're trying to run away or chase an enemy and need that extra distance. Here's a clip of what I mean. You basically want to cancel your W as soon as you're closer to that side of the wall that you want to be on. You don't really use this that much, but it could be the difference between life and death when you do. Last but not least, W resets. As you know, your W cooldown resets by 90% with a kill or assist, not instantly. So plan flight paths accordingly. If you're gonna go in and kill the backline during a team fight, you need to make sure and be confident that you can survive for at least 3 seconds before flying out. Before moving on, I also wanted to mention kiting with your W as well. As not always you're going to be using your W offensively, sometimes it's better to W back and do damage to an enemy trying to chase you down. Just in general, make sure to know that your W can be used as an escape tool as well. Another thing I just remembered is that you want to make sure that before you W out, you need to know if the enemy used their CC ability so that you don't get canceled when you're trying to fly out. So be wary of that. And now on to the E. I'd say using your E is pretty self-explanatory, as this is the ability that you want to lead with on most combos. Couple of things to keep in mind though. You don't actually have to execute minions / monsters to get the stack. They just have to die within the center as long as it's active. E placement is a huge fundamental with this ability. Like any other AoE ability, you want to make sure that where you place it is where it'll reach the most amount of enemies as possible. Make sure to use choke points to your advantage, as enemies are forced to walk through it. Some of these choke points include here, 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 and here. As you've probably experienced, Aesol is the king of countering sieges, as you can stall sieges for extensive periods of time by just pressing E before the wave reaches your tower. Moving off of how your minions interact with your E, you can also do some cool wave manipulation things with your E. Like preventing a siege, E before a wave hits your tower and threaten a freeze. Just make sure to do it a little early so your E doesn't chunk the minion's health like this. Stealing minions and camps are also some situations that pop up. If you get prio and you're pushed up in a lane, sometimes you can walk to enemy raptors, E right before they decide to kill them, and you'll actually get the gold from it due to your execute. You can also do this when contesting things like scuttle and buffs. And lastly, his R. The most frustrating aspect of this ability is the missile speed. You've probably noticed that even if you feel like you aimed perfectly, the enemy just walks right out of it. There are a couple of things to work around this. I recommend, instead of predicting where the enemy will walk, just aim the R so that the center of the ability is where they're actually standing at the time of your cast. From my experience, this is the highest percentage in which you'll actually land. The most important thing in being able to land his R is knowing whether or not they have flash or their dash up. For example, you would never lead with your R in an all-in on an Ezreal. Instead, you would want to fly towards him and Q, wait for his dash, and then drop your R. So it's really important before you get into game to take a mental note of each dash of enemy champions so you can plan accordingly. Lastly, we're going to go over how to use your empowered R efficiently. I would never, ever use your empowered R for a single normal kill. I would only use the empowered R in these situations: a significant shutdown, a major team fight, or in a skirmish that'll get you a major lead or objective after the fight. It's really important to pick and choose when you want to decide to use your empowered R, as you only get 3 to 4 of these per game. Remember that your empowered R does have a shockwave that basically covers the whole map, so sometimes if a kill is worth it, you can use that shockwave to finish them off. And now on to every single combo you need to be successful. E, R. You basically want to use this combo every time you drop an R, as the slow from your E really helps your R land. E, Q. This is your main and only wave clear technique. E, R, Q. This is going to be your lead combo when you want to save your W for a chase. W, Q. This one's pretty self-explanatory. W, E, R, Q. This is going to be your highest damage output combo. W, Q, flash while maintaining your Q. Pretty much the flashiest combo you're going to get on the champion, but it's super effective when you need that extra distance to secure a kill, as you're bounded to a line during your W. And now that you know what kind of champion Aesol is, what his abilities do, and how to use his abilities, let's discuss actually getting onto the Rift and performing with him. Let's start with his laning. Before we talk about this section, I recommend watching one of my recent videos called Aurelion Soul's early game is way stronger than you think, as it shows actual gameplay of me playing certain lane matchups and how to fundamentally play him in lane. During the lane phase, people think that Aurelion Soul should just take E level 1 and just AFK farm until 20 minutes and just not interact with anyone, which is just completely wrong. Aesol's laning phase can actually be really strong at times if you know how to utilize Q taps and Q holds in lane. Here's an example from that video that I mentioned of Aesol laning being used to its maximum potential, utilizing Q taps, Q holds, and good positioning. So he walks in the lane here and I instantly get a Q. It's really important, level 1, either stand in the bush down here or stand in the middle of the lane so that if the enemy decides to walk here or here, you can look for Q opportunities like this. I looked for it and his health bar is already chunked. But this guy is just not giving up this wave, and because of that, I flash Q and he instantly dies. Playing Aesol in lane is just about finding the correct spacing and Q angles to be able to win trades in the early game. There's so much more depth to this champion that people don't realize. Laning really separates good Aesols from the bad Aesols. I honestly think I can make an hour-long video of each fundamental thing you should be doing in the laning phase, not just playing Aesol, but playing any champion in general. There are just some things like jungle tracking, hugging a specific side of the map based on where the enemy jungle is, the 115 ward, wave management, and just so much more that I'm not going to cover in this specific video, as this is an Aurelion Soul guide, not a mid lane guide. But I am planning to make videos on those soon if that's something that you guys are interested in. I do also offer one-on-one coaching, so if you guys really want to get into the nitty-gritty mid lane fundamentals, please check out the link in the description and maybe we can book a one-on-one session. Now, what we are going to do is talk about laning specific things for the champion Aurelion Soul. Starting with the question of whether you should be worrying about stacks during the laning phase. The short answer is no. You are going to accumulate stacks throughout the game just by interacting with enemy champions, and you should really just be focusing on getting good trades, last hitting, and having good wave management, and just in general not dying. Obviously, if you have the chance to grab some stacks in the early game, go for it, but it shouldn't be your main priority. You can play aggressively, guys. As you guys saw in the Vlad clip, I solo killed this guy, and you can too. Walk up at level 1 and take trades. If the trades go well, look to be prepared to take W as soon as you hit level 2 and fly towards them, either for a good trade or even a kill sometimes. You may be wondering, but Soul, what if the jungle ganks you? This is where having down the fundamentals of League and jungle tracking will really help you on Aurelion Soul and any other mid lane champ in general that you decide to play. If you don't have this knowledge down, you need to either book a session with me or any coach or just do your own research, as it will really help you just not dying on the champion and again on other champions decide to play. There's a reason that challenger players can just turbo smurf first timing champs and lower elos, as they have their fundamentals of League of Legends down, which is 10 times more important than any champion mastery that you could have. With that being said, even though Aurelion Soul's laning is stronger than what most people think, he definitely has matchups where he gets absolutely countered and you can't really take trades, which is just the reality of playing a scaling champion. This leads me to my next point, Aurelion Soul counters and good matchups for Aesol. I'm going to put matchups into 4 categories, as League matchups are not as black and white as it seems. There's good early game matchups, poke matchups, complete Aurelion Soul counters, and good all-around matchups. Some good early game matchups include Vlad, Katarina, Zed, yeah, I know guys, and Kiana. As you see, most of these champions are assassin champs. Assassin champs have an insanely weak level 1, so starting Q in these matchups and walking up and trading and zoning them from the wave really makes it favorable for Aesol for the first couple of levels. Sometimes you can even get a solo kill around level 2, but the reason this section of matchups is called, quote, good early game matchups is that they are only good matchups in the early game. As we know, for example, Zed starts to become really unplayable when he gets level 6, and you can do nothing but try not to die. However, playing aggressively in the early game and getting ahead versus these champions can really help you out once these champions hit their power spike. Then we have poke matchups like Ziggs, Xerath, Syndra, and Lux. You can almost categorize these champions as skill matchups. The good thing about poke matchups is that the enemy actually has to aim and hit their abilities to win their lane. If you can try and bait out their main poke ability, you can walk up for Q holds and Q taps. Do this 3 to 4 times in a row, and they have to start respecting your all-in. You also have to watch out for CC abilities like Lux Q, Syndra E, Xerath E, but there are ways to play around it. You can try and walk up and Q tap while sidestepping to try and bait out their CC and instantly W towards them for a good trade, as they have no way of canceling your flight. Or you can even use minions to your advantage on non-AoE CC abilities and use minions to block their CC like in this clip. Basically, get creative with it, guys. Onto the complete Aurelion counters like Fizz, Yone, Nico, Kassadin, Zoe. In these matchups, you can still go for Q taps and Q holds at times, but you're usually not going to be able to find a kill or get a solid trade down. What I would recommend when playing versus these champions is just to sit back, last hit, go for Q taps, play the waves correctly, and just don't die and wait for your jungler. Remember guys, we are scaling champs, so even if we are 0-0-0 at 25 minutes, we are still going to be pretty strong as long as we don't get too behind in golden XP. And lastly, we have good all-around matchups like Vladimir, Orianna, Twisted Fate, and yeah, that's That's it. So Aesol is a scaling champ and very rarely has complete favorable matchups, but there's definitely a spectrum when it comes to the easiest to play matchups and the completely unplayable matchups. Even in these quote-unquote good matchups, you can get completely taken advantage of by good players. But these matchups are definitely way easier than the rest, as they don't really have a way to cancel your W plus Q all in, with the exception of Twisted Fate, but with TF, you just wait till it uses his card and then you can just go in for free. Obviously, I didn't get super in-depth with each individual matchup as it would take hours and hours of explaining, but I do upload weekly on the channel about games for specific matchups, so please make sure to subscribe if you're interested in learning more about specific matchups. But if you just follow the general tools and general tips for each category of matchups, you're going to be completely fine. So now that we covered laning, we can actually get into the mid to late game and how to actually close out games. So if you've gone through laning phase and you're in a good spot in the mid game, you're basically got the game halfway won, since all you got to do now is just scale. Again, same thing with laning. There are just some general League of Legends fundamentals that I'm not going to cover and that you need to learn by yourself, like macro, warding, being at objectives at the correct time, cross map plays, side landing, and much more. But there are some important Aesol related mid to late game things that you need to know. Starting with stacking. We decided in the early game that it's not important to stack, but here in the mid to late game is where we need to start intuitively grabbing stacks for ourselves by going to the side lanes and farming and taking camps like Krugs and Raptors, as well as participating in team fights. Note that if you decide to go to a side lane, you should know that if there is a team fight that comes up, you either have TP to be there or be in range to use your W to fly to it. Otherwise, you're just really trolling your team. And then there's picks. As we know, Aesol's W range can get quite large as the game progresses. We can utilize this to our advantage by flying to the enemy squishies in the side lane to pick them out. But make sure you have enough information on the map to know that you won't die 1v1, the enemy team can't retaliate, and it's actually a worthwhile pick. Lastly, we have pretty much the most important aspect of League of Legends: team fights. Your goal in team fights is pretty simple: CC and kill valuable enemies. 90% of team fights are literally just dropping your E and R on the most valuable targets and playing with your frontline to stay safe and deal damage. For all you visual learners, here are some well-played team fights that show you how you should be playing fights. I'm going to position in the pit. Oh, big. Big. Good W line. Oh, that was clean, man. That was absolutely clean. That was absolutely clean. If I were to simplify a basic mid to late game plan, it would be like this: side lane and farm, look for picks, walk to major objective fights, side lane some more, repeat until the game is blown up and you've won enough fights to take towers, inhibitors, and hopefully eventually their nexus. Okay, almost there, guys. Let's finally get into his build and runes. Before I get into this section, I want to make something clear that I feel like people should really understand. Play is 10 times more important than build. you can build the most suboptimal basic build on any champion and still climb to diamond as long as you're playing the game correctly. That doesn't mean that building properly doesn't help. It definitely does, and it can help you win more games. There are a couple of builds right now that a lot of ASO players are doing, and I'm going to help you navigate them. For example, my build right now is starting item, Doran's Ring and Pots, and then during your first back, you'll probably have around 700-ish gold on your first base, so just grab Seal and tier 1 boots. Then we go into Lost Chapter, as this really helps with mana issues. Then start rushing Rallies without finishing the Mythic. And then after you finish Rallies, you want to try and finish your Mythic, which a lot of people question what Mythics you should go. For my personal build, and what most Aurelion Soul players build, are either Crown if you're facing champions who can kind of get on top of you and it's just easy for you to die, or you would go Leandries if the enemy team is tanky. That's it. You can 100% climb to Master just building these 2 Mythics. I know people talk about going Ludens or Rod of Ages, and I'm telling you right now just to ignore them. Yes, those Mythics can be viable, but it just becomes way too complicated and people overthink it. Just go either Crown or Leandries, it's just that simple. So going into our third item, our build should look something like this. Rylai's, Crown or Leandries, tier 1 boots, and Seal. Around this time, you want to finish your tier 2 boots into Sork shoes. The third item is where it gets a little complicated, I'm not going to lie, but I'm going to make it really easy for you guys. So for the third item, you should go Hourglass if you feel like Crown isn't enough to keep you alive, or if you went Ludens and need something defensive. Or go Void Staff if you don't really need a defensive item and the enemy team is stacking MR. Or you could go into Rebidons if you don't need either Void or Hourglass. In rare scenarios, if you feel confident that you won't die, you can even finish Seal as long as you have 10 stacks on it, which be into Mejai's. There are some people like Korean ASO players who would argue Horizon Focus third, which I don't disagree with. It's just that people are still testing whether or not the item is still even worth it. So I'm going to leave it out of my build path, but feel free to do your own research and look up Korean ASO builds if you just want to give that a shot. Other than that, Hourglass, Void, and Rebidons will do well for your third item. Your fourth item depends on what item you went third. If you went Hourglass and now that you see that they're building MR, go Void. If they're not, go Rebidons. If you went Void and you don't need anti-heal, go Rebidons. If you went Rebidons and you don't need anti-heal, but they're starting to build MR, go Void. You can see where this is going. And your fifth item is the same case. It just depends on what you build last item and what you need based on the current situation of the game. To simplify it, let me just give you a couple of full builds examples versus different comps. If you're facing a tanky comp, Rylai's, Leandries, Sork Shoes, Void, Rebidons, and Horizon. If you're facing a high damage squishy comp, go Rylai's, Crown, Sork, Hourglass, Rebidons, and Horizon. The fifth item really just depends on what you think you need in the super late game. Sometimes Banshees is even worth it if they have like a Blitz or Karthus, but generally Horizon is a good fifth item. If you're facing a tanky comp but have a super fed assassin, Rylai's, Leandries, Sork, Hourglass, Void, and Horizon. I hope you're starting to see a pattern. So just get creative with it, guys. If you are still having trouble on what to build, because I know it sounds a little bit complicated, just what I did when I first started playing was you can literally go to sites like op.gg and analytics and search up what high elo ASO players are building and copy them. But if you have any questions and you want me to clarify on something, feel free to leave a comment down below. Okay, so now that we know what items you should go, what runes should you go? Runes on him are really simple in my opinion. In fact, I'm going to give you my runes, and runes you can literally go every single game up until Grandmaster. It really just depends on how you want to play him. For my runes, created by one of the top ASO players, shout out Diablo, is Sorcery Tree Primary, Comet, Mana Flow, Absolute Focus, Scorch, and then secondary is Presence of Mind and Coup de Grace. The playstyle of this tree is for players who just want to be active in the laning phase, constantly proccing our Mana Flow, Scorch, Absolute Focus, and Presence with Q-taps and Q-holds, which we talked about earlier in the guide. If you want a tree you can literally go every single game, just go this. So same primary tree of Sorcery, Comment, Absolute Focus, and Scorch, but instead of Precision, take Inspiration and go Magical Footwear and Cookies. And obviously you just go double adaptive and MR or armor based on the enemy laner that you're facing. So this rune tree pretty much plays for itself by saving you some extra gold with free tier 1 boots and giving you extra lane sustain with cookies. So if you're new to the champ, I'd recommend starting with this setup as you get used to the champion. So there you have it, guys. let's conclude. Aurelion Sol is a late game hyper carry scaling mage who has a weak early game, but definitely has angles to win trades in lane. Make sure to use your abilities optimally with correct spacing, combos, and W lines in order to play the champion mechanically well. Don't focus on stacks in the early game, wait for the mid to late game to focus on stacks, and play teams fights correctly. Follow all of this and you will be absolutely 1v9ing in your games in no time. Me and my editor Spray worked super hard on bringing this guide to you, so I'd really appreciate it if you could take the time and drop a like, subscribe to the channel, as it would really help bring my dream to reality of becoming a full-time content creator. If you guys have any questions at all, just feel free to put them in the comments below. If you have any questions about the guide, any of the combos, the build, just want to say what's up. I will be looking at comments pretty much all day as soon as this comes up. I just wanted to thank you guys so much for everything you've done. Thank you guys so much for the support. I'm really glad that I could bring a guide to you guys, and hopefully you guys think this was worth the wait. I worked super hard on it. Me and my editor worked super hard on it. I just try to make the content as learnable as possible, and I really hope you guys enjoy. So thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it. Thank you guys so much for the support, and love you guys. Thanks for watching.